On Sunday, July 24, 2016, dive instructor Nigel Craig began a deep specialty course dive for his student, Richard Stansfield. Tragically, it would be Richard's final dive. They were entering the depths of a disused flooded quarry in Leicestershire, UK, a popular dive training site. But the events that would follow would be the beginning of a hellish chapter in Nigel's life, as he was prosecuted for his student's death. This case led to medical discoveries that would change dive training forever. This is their story. Stoney Cove has a long history of being a popular dive training site, stemming from beginners to deep specialty dives, and for good reason. The massive flooded quarry is easy to access and has several shelves of different depths ranging from 7 meters to 35 meters at its deepest point. Its location, history, and depth make it the perfect training location. This is a place that Nigel Craig was intimately familiar with. Nigel himself had learned how to dive in Stoney Cove in 1996, and after 20 years, he was now an instructor there. Over the years, he had completed hundreds of dives as both a diver and instructor for his local dive center, Dive Northampton. Nigel was a true veteran of the quarry and knew every inch of its terrain. So when Richard Stansfield, a 40-year-old advanced open water certified diver, approached Nigel to become a certified deep diver, things were quickly put into motion. To earn his certification, Richard would have to complete 3 separate dives with an instructor. The first was already completed during his open water certification, and his second dive would be scheduled for Sunday, July 24, 2016, at Stoney Cove. The course's purpose is to better help divers understand the effects of pressure at depth, how increased air consumption and nitrogen loading necessitate shorter dive times, how narcosis can affect diver judgment, and the importance of making safety stops to mitigate the potential for decompression sickness. For those of you that have watched my previous diving or cave diving videos, all of these topics are reoccurring factors in things going wrong under the water. When arriving at Stoney Cove, you pull your car up to a small parking lot, unload your gear, and walk down a small staircase right next to the bank of the water, before walking another 100 yards or so to the first entrance into the water. It is a small staircase surrounded by an old metal guardrail, with 2 or 3 steps above water before disappearing into the depths. The plan on July 24th was to follow this exact route, where Nigel Craig, his dive partner Carol Tokarczyk, and Richard Stansfield would enter the water while putting on their gear. They would then have a short briefing and safety check before making a 100-meter swim to a descent line, marking an area in the cove that led to the hyperbox at a depth of 35 meters. The metal structure used for commercial dive training, and recreational instructors used it for deep dives. After reaching the depth, they would then ascend back to 5 meters, where they would make a mandatory 3-minute safety stop before surfacing. Now, this is important, as it will later come back in the story. After going over the plan one final time, the trio would begin their surface swim out to the dive line, and after reaching the correct area, they would wait a few minutes on the surface for Richard to catch his breath. Once he was ready, the trio would put their regulators into their mouths and begin the descent. It took approximately 10 minutes to reach the dive's maximum depth of 32 meters. Normally, this is a faster process, but during the descent, Richard had trouble with his buoyancy. After reaching the bottom of the quarry, Nigel would complete an air check. This is where he noticed that Richard had 150 bars remaining in his 12-liter cylinder. For perspective, Richard had started the dive with 250. Now, this wasn't a crisis moment, mainly because Richard and his partner Carol each had an extra 12-liter canister of air, but it certainly perked Nigel's eyebrows. He made a mental note to double-check Richard's air supplies in a few minutes, but first they were going to complete a navigation exercise. During this exercise, Richard was struggling with his buoyancy. His body was slowly floating towards the surface, and he continuously had to adjust to keep himself submerged with the other 2 divers. Nigel cut the exercise short to repeat the test, and during the second attempt, Richard would pass with flying colors. This is when Nigel would check Richard's air supply for a second time, and he would receive a signal for 60 bars. This was much less than Nigel expected based on his earlier check, so he immediately signaled for the dive to end and begin the ascent. On the way up, he would signal for Carroll to continue to check Richard's air supply, and at 18 meters, Richard would indicate that he was out of air, even though Carroll saw that there were 20 bars left in his tank. Nigel would later state, "There was no indication of any heavy breathing, no sign of panic, nothing like that. So I decided to swap him onto Carroll's alternate." After getting reassurance from Richard, now that he was breathing from Carroll's alternate tank, the group would continue to ascend, but once again, Richard would soon signal that he was out of air. At this point, Nigel was confused. Carroll had purged the regulator and everything was working fine, yet Richard could not breathe. Carroll would make the decision to put him on his own tank. They locked eyes, and Carroll gave the calm down signal. Richard would give the okay, and they would carry on. As they approached the final 5 meters, Nigel thought that it was still prudent to make the 3-minute safety stop, as Richard was calm and there was still plenty of air. 2 minutes into the safety stop, issues would begin again. Richard, out of nowhere, would panic and try to bolt for the surface, but Nigel would quickly reach out and grab him, trying to prevent him from making an unsafe ascent. In the confusion, Richard's regulator would be pulled from his mouth. Nigel would later state that he didn't understand why Richard was saying he's got no air when he does. Everything was working just fine, yet Richard couldn't breathe. Nigel would look up at Richard's eyes, and they would glaze over. That's when he noticed the regulator was not in Richard's mouth. He signaled to Carroll to ascend, and Nigel, along with Richard, would ascend seconds later, but it was too late. Nigel would immediately shout for help, and after being picked up by a rescue boat, Richard would be resuscitated by paramedics and taken by ambulance to the hospital. 5 hours later, Richard would be pronounced dead. After the accident, Nigel and his wife Della would move on with their lives, at least as best they could. But in September of 2020, 4 long years after the accident, Nigel would receive a letter informing him that he would be prosecuted for gross negligence manslaughter. Nigel would state that he was knocked backwards. He didn't know what was going on. The prosecution would base their case on the idea that Nigel had held his unwilling student underwater and the misguided belief that a safety stop was more important than preventing him drowning. It was conceded during the trial that there were no issues with the planning and execution up until the final 5 meters. Dive computer records submitted as evidence would show that Richard had misreported his air supply by as much as 30 bars during the first air check. And the biggest defense for Nigel was that while expert divers were testifying, they would state, "I have been on both ends of the octopus, and I know of no instructor who would skip a safety stop after a 30-meter dive with an adequate supply of air available." The prosecution would switch gears and argue that Nigel controlled Richard's buoyancy to keep him underwater while he drowned, but this was dismissed due to Carroll being by Nigel's side and seen as utterly ridiculous that a dive master would sit back and let that happen. During the trial, a former military diver would state that he had encountered a situation similar to Richard's in a previous case. A diver signaling out of air when they still have a working supply is a recognized sign of immersion pulmonary edema, a condition where the lungs spontaneously fill with fluid upon immersion in cold water, and if untreated, eventually causes the diver to asphyxiate. Even in 2016, very few people knew anything about it, and to this day, information is just now being implemented into training. Eventually, after 2 days of deliberation, Nigel would be found not guilty, but the damage was done. After 20 years and hundreds of dives, Nigel would lose his sole source of income as he could not cope with working as an instructor any longer. Nigel would state, "I will never teach again. I would like to dive again, probably not in this country." The local dive community not only lost one of their members, but they would also lose one of the most experienced and respected dive instructors. Many believe that Nigel Craig should have never been prosecuted and that he was not responsible for the death of a student. But the simple truth is that if Richard had never died, it is still possible we may not fully understand IPO. Today, Nigel just wants his story out there, with the hope that more accidents that may involve IPO just may be prevented and lives can be saved.